But otherwise, it's Jarek, and I'm here because this idea of self-identifying with a certain trend. I don't think that any artist likes to do this unless it's for various purposes. Well, like for example, to meet people, to talk to other artists. So my reason that I'm here is not because I somehow feel that please I want to be a visual musician, because any kind of definition is always a straitjacket, and I think we don't like it. And so my whole presentation today is, of course, trying to understand visual music, but it's probably trying to understand what is it that I do, and possibly how it connects also to you here present in some ways. But of course, I'm using words, so it is a straitjacket because even in the piece that I'll be talking about, words are part of it too. So I'm using one of the layers of my, let's say, the medium. That's only one of the media of what this is all about, to express it. And of course, the piece itself, luckily, will be presented tonight. So I guess hopefully it will actually say what it means. And you will be able to read how it's done for yourself, how you believe it is. Yeah, I'm a composer from education, and performer and pianist. So I come from that kind of tree. But my imagination was always audiovisual. Whenever I was asked to write a piece or something, I never actually thought about the sound as a source. I thought about an energy or something that I wanted to express that was meta sound, even though I come from that musical stem. Doing these audiovisual pieces it's exciting to me to do them because I like to integrate things, and I know that it's kind of impossible. And so I agree with Adrian there that this idea of sync is a kind of a holy grail, but you can't really get it, although I do it all the time. And we do it all the time. So there's a contradiction there. But that's a fun contradiction that I enjoy, and I enjoy putting things together that I agree also with some speakers yesterday that there's no common harmony. There are lots of things that are not in common. So that challenge is really exciting to me. So I will talk to you about Oli's dream, and what I will use as a different kind of straitjacket for it because straitjackets, of course, are a problem for us, but errors, like problems, then help us define something. So hopefully, by the not fitting of what I'm going to say, maybe some interesting things will come about. And I want to use the jacket of Aristotle, because we have different histories. And a long time ago, I read this very interesting book by Lawrence E. Marks, Unity of the Senses, in which he references common sensibles, a term coined by Aristotle. So Oli's Dream is the piece that I'll play tonight, and I will use it also I will try to merge those two things, the ideas of Aristotle with this piece, and we'll see what comes out. So I'll talk a little bit about the concept of the piece, its material, its technical paradigm, and performance idiom, which are all kind of tied in so that we know what we're talking about. But then I'll go deeper into these questions of so what is this, so what are the common sensibles, how I kind of rephrase them, and then an attempt at the idea of counterpoint, which again it's a kind of a failure, but that's really interesting why it's a failure. If it is a failure, I don't know, it's just a question. So there will be some conclusions. But Oli's Dream is a piece that I was lucky to collaborate on with a poet, and it's a piece that I did about 2 years ago. Let me play for you a fragment so that you know what we're talking about. So it's going to be just the opening 2 minutes. Okay, so what is actually the piece made of? And I use this because then later I'll actually refer to some of this material. So there are various layers. Of course, it's very referential. It's very much objet trouvé. There's a lot of this stuff going on. But this was a score that I used when I was working on the piece, and so it helps to explain. Of course, there's the piano, which you will see live tonight, which is actually here. This is what I play. There's a virtual piano, so kind of an abstract sound object. Which actually comes triggered from the computer. So it's basically kind of samples, fragments that are triggered. Then there's a tape part, which is, well, there are actually some sounds that, some of them are kind of the diegetic sounds, because of course you see things being typed, so you hear it being typed. Space, sound, scrolling, and everything. But there are all these other sounds that you don't really hear, but they're referenced maybe to the meanings and stuff. So they are not strictly diegetic, but actually logical, or kind of more or less logical, but to me they felt logical. And then there's, of course, the video part, which is just typing letters, and of course that brings with itself the text and meanings. But of course, all of these have other referential things, and I'll get to the question of these the potentialities for referentiality in music and other dimensions later. But so there are actually many layers here that are through composed and. Okay, so technically how it's done is, I'm going to go really fast through this. It's a max patch. Of course, you have note inputs, so whenever I play the piano, it goes through a following switch, which is basically as a score, and it's like in a chamber musician situation. I have my part, the computer has its part. It follows me and plays its part by sending things to the sound and video players. So there is actually a score, and the score, this is my, older version of my score. And if I want to show you how many different triggers there are, well, this is how it looks. All the blue points are basically trigger points for something in the image. Sometimes it's even more than one object. But let's say that these are the sensitive notes. Whenever I play those, the computer is doing something. The red points are also the same situation, except that these are just single frames, usually visually, or a couple of frames. Well, these are actually running QuickTime. So here I'm pretty much in control of the timing. When I trigger this event, then it's actually QuickTime running, and then I'm watching it when it finishes, or whenever I need to come through this. So there is a kind of stop and go of the QuickTime. Everything is actually QuickTime in terms of video. And of course, so there's a very strict integration of things through the programming, but of course there's also integration of the whole situation to me as a performer, and it means that actually I need to practice audiovisually. So to really do it well, I have to have a computer with a projection. It's very good to do it from memory, so that I can look at the screen, and so it really gets integrated, and then it actually creates an opportunity for a very funny situation for a musician where I actually sing without speaking, without singing, without voicing, because I'm actually saying things with text, however, just through playing the piano. So it's kind of an interesting paradigm. So, but let's now move on deeper to these questions of common sensibles, of the material. And so how are all these interconnected? And as I said earlier, this actually comes from Aristotle. And he names quite a few. The principal one is, of course, motion rest, and motion rest kind of comes with, or maybe I should explain, what does he mean by common sensibles? These are things that can be perceived by different senses. So you can perceive motion and rest, or rest through hearing, through seeing, through touch, almost any sense. And so these are the common sensibles, which are kind of meta sense. And form and shape, clearly. You can recognize even some higher species, other mammals can recognize the same shape and sound and image, not only us, but not all animals, but some can do that. Can recognize this similarity in size, intensity, brightness, number, unity, and solidity. So these are the common sensibles according to Aristotle. Now, I want to take a little bit different reading of that, or let's say place most of them in one of the functions, and this actually comes from it's a kind of a paraphrasing of Rudolf Arnheim's book on visual thinking, where there are these beautiful chapters about abstraction. I love the chapter titled "What Abstraction Is Not." He has that wonderful chapter then out, and then he gets actually what abstraction is. But he also talks about the question of functioning of pictures, and I think that we also have this in audiovisual art and intermedia, visual music, how things function, and they can function on the level of structure, on symbol and sign, and so usually the structure, so a very low level of abstraction, has all these qualitative parameters, and this is where a lot of the mapping pieces place themselves, because they really just care about parameters, not to mention that it's of course easier to get to those with technology. You can measure various things. So this is really very low level of abstraction of the structure, where we can connect things where that common sensible happens. And these are the temporal, formal, how things progress in time, that are pretty abstract, but they still are, there can be common or not common. You can create these correspondences. And there are also textural in the amount of things that's going on simultaneously in time, how that is structured. Also you can create similarities or contrasts. But this, we didn't go to the higher level of symbol and meaning. Because, if I have a letter, or let's say just the word no typed small like this or big like this, the meaning of it is actually not the same. I mean, I shouldn't have even said no. Any letter, a small letter and a big letter, changes just by size, kind of changes its meaning, particularly if it's done in a context. There's a certain drama suddenly to a growth of a letter. So for sure, there is a lot of meaning. There is a potentiality in the certain very abstract parameters for them to be actualized as certain meaning. And how that happens is actually very much by, in the case of audiovisual art, how things are happening in time. But I'll get to that later. So, but here we are actually going to the more, let's say, less unexpected way of how we create meaning. Although we are used to what I just said, but still, the more obvious way of creating meaning is, of course, a representation, where we see or we hear things that we recognize right away. And so on that level, of course, the cultural archetype or the emotional psychological state, and that's, of course, where a lot of film music operates, where the music doesn't want to point to any of its structural qualities. It rather wants to act in the symbolic, if we call it that way. And then, of course, I totally agree with the speaker from yesterday, who said that, of course, there's nothing that... I mean, everything goes with everything in the audiovisual domain. You can actually, there's a level at which you can connect anything with anything, and it works. And in fact, it can work very convincingly if you just repeat it a few times. So the idea that also Adrian at some point is showing, okay, this is the beginning of the piece. The beginning of pieces in audiovisual works are extremely important, because this is where you establish, okay, so what is the connection? Okay. And then you play on that. So you can actually establish the most absurd things on the beginning. We've learned it, and it works. And it doesn't have to be absurd, but it can be absurd, and it actually can be very interesting that way. And this is actually where I'm leading right now, which is it possible to use this in a kind of contrapuntal way? And what do we mean by contrapoint? That's a kind of a good question, because if you think about the term contrapoint, we know from music, okay? And of course, in music, it means what? We are told that it's actually in the domain of pitch. Okay, very limited domain of music, pitch. The counterpoint, there was of course a situation where people tried other things, but normally that's what was perceived. So, extreme limitation. Okay, the counterpoint in pitch, it means that linearly things are independent, vertically they are kind of dependent. However, linearly they also have some kind of logic after all, and there's of course the idea of probably of consonance and dissonance included in this. But that idea of independence is, I think, what gets us really excited about counterpoint, is that things can deny being together or something, but then can be together again. So again, consonance, dissonance, togetherness, not togetherness. And this idea of whether image and sound can be together or not together, this is, I guess, an interesting question. And the sign theory says that, well, everything will be together whatever you try. So in a sense, counterpoint is not possible in audiovisual media, because we will always glue things together as right. We are forced to do this. I'm kind of provoking you here, because I'm not sure that I even agree with myself. But there is a way of seeing it that way, which, of course, that's the case.
3 minutes.
Sorry? 3 minutes? Oh, wow. It's going to be more theoretical than practical. So, well, you'll see the piece later. So, yeah. So let's just use one example here of this. I'm going to play for you this moment when I play all the ends. And the text is relatively static. It's just repeated end. The image is pretty static. You know, I'm adding one more end to it, so there's not a lot of excitement. Music has some of staticity, because we see that those F's. By the way, how many of you do not read music notation in this room? Now we know what's visual music about. It used to be that, except for one person, thanks for your honesty. We all now are really connected to music. So there are actually, you know, I'm going to play this fragment then, and you will hear that the music actually has an independent thing going on. So yeah, music kind of flows. It seems to be wanting to pull us somewhere else and tells us a different story. Well, there's this persistent nothingness going, a static thing going everywhere. However, of course, there is that F-sharp note in the piano, which suddenly is being pulled out of its normally secondary role. If you would be listening to this just as music, you probably would not really pay attention to the F-sharp, because you will be hearing the melody. But here I'm pointing to you kind of playfully so that you pay attention to the unimportant, and it turns out to be important somehow. And so this idea of pointing by synchronicity is kind of interesting, because what I mentioned to you earlier, that you can actually pull out of the potentialities, because everything that's visual or sound or whatever has multiple dimensions, and you make the decision as an artist which of those dimensions you point to, and what is it that you just say, pay attention to this or that. And so I guess counterpoint is possible if you, in a clever way, create somehow that limitation. So you point people, okay, listen now to that or other dimension, and then perhaps there are not that many dimensions. In fact, if we go, so I'm going to run to this. Sorry, I have to someone example. So if I go back to. I don't know how that's like. But if you go at that back to the idea of the different qualitative and symbolic meanings, they're happening simultaneously all the time. The level of sign, the level of symbol, the level of abstraction happens all the time. This is actually the magic of music or any art, is that there are all these potentialities, and in fact that's why we never hear the same thing, all of us here in the room, because at different points of time we listen to different layers of that. And the composer can try to point you to certain things, and sometimes he's more successful than other times, but it really depends very much on you. There's all of that. And so the idea of counterpoint, that equality of layers, is the question of which layer. Is it possible? It's not really possible. You really choose. You have. It's a very complex situation. And that idea of actualization, and so that F sharp that actualizes for you or the N that actualizes for you the F sharp in the structure is of course just something that I try to do. But at the same time, there is so much else going on there. Well, even just those harmonic shifts in the melody. I don't need to explain. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here. So this idea of counterpoint is really interesting. But that the curse of the sign and how it works with synchronizing things is there, and I think we have to be aware. So that syncresis is really very, very important to remember about. Anyways, yeah, I guess I had too many things I wanted to say, so it became a little bit more chaotic. But this is probably it.
Very much for that end example. It's fabulous because I need an example. The word, I found the word, but not the example. The word is syntropic, which is things that point in the same direction. So if you ask where things point, you can do a really interesting, as you did, analysis. Because for me, when I was listening to that F sharp, it was, I'm sure you were playing it at the same loudness, but the rest of the harmony actually pulled it up and down. Not in pitch so much, although that percept does sometimes happen. But in this case, it was, so we had another kind of counterpoint then, because visually the ends kept coming at pretty much the same visual density. So there's probably an arrow diagram that you can do around that thing that might be more valuable than the classical, what are we lining up, the cue sheet model.
Yeah, definitely this idea of pointing to me is really, really important. But there's the question of memory, of also what we remember and how things develop in time. So that the layering also goes in these structures in time, which gives it even more complex. So there are, in fact, I say there is no counterpoint, but there's a 1 million counterpoints going on there at the same time. So. I don't know.
I think that sometimes composers underestimate listeners' ability to find correlations. And there is a true line of thinking what Adrian brought before, like narratively, like composers pointing things all the time. And at the same time, there is a need to give some kind of reference and to where to look for. So I think it's really compositional. One of the most important compositional tasks is how to construct a system of pointing. So there is a little bit second layer of the thing. So composers don't have to, yoke around the listeners where to listen. So I think that's kind of worth to look at along with your proposition, where to look. And in counterpoint, there's a lot of potentiality. Some kind of constructing system of a self-referential point that can go out to listeners' mind and listeners' ears.
Well, I think pointing is really what we do as artists. This is kind of our this is what we do. We watch the world, and this is our privilege and our obligation. And we say, okay, this is what I care about. This is what you guys should notice. That's basically what artists do. And of course, how friendly we are at pointing, it kind of depends. That's probably a stylistic thing. I'm a friendly guy, so I love you guys. So I say, if I want to show you the bird that is beautiful, I want to point right on the bird, rather than say, somewhere there is something that I like to. Some of my colleagues in my department prefer that approach. I don't mind. It's their style. This is very interesting. This idea of how you point, how much you point.
Brian, then John.
I think you've got counterpoint here going very, very effectively, and I'm not sure why you're even questioning that. The whole essence of counterpoint is this horizontal and vertical sort of unfolding, and the idea that you have these moments of vertical consonance, but the integrity of the individual lines, so that you always maintain the sense of the individual, as Adrian said, we avoid the parallel fits, right? That was the whole reason we avoid the parallel fits, because all of a sudden you lose the integrity of the individual lines. But here, you've got this counterpoint of activity, which is, the essence of cinematic language. You have these many, many things all existing in layers, moving, and this increases almost becomes those sort of moments of confidence that you can work with it. You know, and I'd say you have this whole other layer because it's not just text, it's typewritten text. Right? So there's a whole other layer of meaning that's happening because I'm not just seeing an N, I'm seeing an N that has existed on a typewriter, and there's no way I can't not then connect that to everything I know about typewritten text in my own personal experience, which is another layer of meaning that is moving through the piece. And I think you've got them all. I mean, it's that to be conscious of that and then to try to take compositional control of all of those as a composer, that to me is what visual music really is understanding you're working in these many layers, and the visual is now something you're also taking musical control over. But you know, whatever musical might mean, but much of it has to do with this passing of time in a narrative way, I believe.
Yeah, in the meaning of time, I probably will not comment, but I like very much what you're saying.
No, we have some time. John?
Oh, yeah.
A quick question. At the beginning of the piece, which is why did you feel the need, I don't know if it was a need or choice or whatever it was, to use the actual sound of the typewriter?
You know, one thing is that I don't know if I should tell you because, well, I'll tell you. We're here. The sound actually disappears later. I don't know if you will notice it, but it's not there yet anymore, because I establish it as, you know, as a given. You know, this is a typewriter. But you know, to tell you the truth, it's an aesthetic choice. I don't know why, but I like to ground music. I kind of feel that it should walk on the ground rather than be somehow this magical, etherical thing. It is still that way, but I like somehow to I don't know, maybe I grew up in a communist country and I kind of feel I want it to be almost a socialist realism kind of thing, you know. So my music has to have that thing, and I like that. You know, if you know some of my other works, you know, Mondrian suddenly turns out to be a construction site, and there is something for me that just is important. But I also wanted to have so maybe I'll actually return to what Brian was saying, which is that when I was using the ends, I don't know if you've noticed, but each of the ends is different because I sampled actually hundreds of letters and then put them in After Effects to manipulate them, because I could not use a typewriter font from a computer because every end would be the same. So the idea of being organic that way was somehow important, and again, real, whatever that means. So probably that's why. Yeah.
So anchoring in reality is important?
Yeah, it's somehow really important to me. And again, it's maybe that attitude that I'm a friendly guy. I want you know, I don't mind being literal. I want to make sure that you get my point. And of course, some of us have different levels of how they feel comfortable about this. This is my way, I guess.
Clarity is much appreciated.
So, Bruno?
Well, I think you partially answered it, but it has to do, actually, you know what, I have to take exception with the statement that any sound can go with any image. And based on my years of experience as a sound editor in the film industry, yes, that could be done, but a distinction has to be made. And I think the typewriter maybe is a good example because you used a naturalistic sound there. And perhaps for many of us, we didn't even notice it because it just fit. It seemed to fit automatically, and it doesn't really say anything. But if you'd used maybe a gunshot or something much more unnatural, it would be perceived differently. It would be perceived as an editorial comment on the situation and not just as an underlining of a naturalistic situation. It corresponds to what Brian was speaking of yesterday as the diegetic versus non-diegetic uses of sound. So, true, you can put anything on anything, but when you cross a certain line, it will be perceived differently. Perhaps it'll be perceived as a whimsical editorial comment or an interesting one, or maybe just an incomprehensible or insane one, you know, depending on the context. But I think that's a distinction that has to be kept in mind and not glossed over.
And in fact, this is the piece that I'm working on right now is based on that idea. I just love the idea of now connecting things that kind of logical, that are not, this is not a dog and its sound. It's actually dog and the sound of something completely different. And again, I'm still working on it. It's a tricky thing. But it's a wonderful thing because exactly it pulls things apart, and it's in a sense it's also in those dimensions. What's really interesting also that some of them can be limited and used like pitch and counterpoint is. It's if you create a scale in them. There's the idea that you're kind of stepping through things, but a lot of the dimensions can only agree or not. So it's only a yes and no kind of thing. It's not a, and you have to also remember that in many of the, particularly the structural ones, image and sound are so far apart and so different that you cannot create this really magical thing called a leading tone. Which, for those of you who don't know, in harmony, it's when you have two pitches in the one, which is like, if you have a scale, da 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 dum, da dum, the ending, pa dum. It's all just in tonal music. But the tension between this pa da, that tension is the magic. It's just being so close, almost there, and then being there. You cannot do it between image and sound. There is not the thing that the image is almost there. Well, you could get it off sync or something. Maybe that's the only place. But in a lot of dimensions, you cannot really do this. This is either or, yes or no kind of thing. So that's also kind of an interesting thing about these materials, how depending on which of those levels you work with, you have limited options. You cannot cannot create counterpoints.
Maybe, there's an interesting question of locus of whatever, whether it's locus of perception or locus of mark making and locus of interpretation. I would leave it there floating as a leading question. Okay. Which may be interesting to use to tease apart the Aristotelian categories and the other categories. So I think one of the most interesting things that's coming out of all this work is a very concrete set of examples of what other people talk about in terms of the difference between the potential and the actual, right? Which also goes back to the Greek. And the question then is, what role, what's the centrality of the unidimensionality of the model of time is being assumed in visual music? I would propose that actually it is very central. It is extremely important that for the work that we're talking about in this domain, and I'm here to hear more, to see more, maybe the unidimensionality itself is quite important, which allows us to, for example, enroll notions. So, for example, the retentive, the retrospective notion, what's happened against the potential, the protentive, looking ahead or thinking ahead, what is about to happen. But kind of triadic structure of time itself depends, maybe, this is just a conjecture, on the fact that we are thinking about the unidimensionality. Having said that, however, it's also possible that it's not the case, that we can have a kind of a tension between the potential and the actual without assuming unidimensionality. I mean, even if one uses visual material, the visual material in some sense is still indexed along one dimension, time, or the putative time. And I think that's the strength. I mean, I think basically that's what allows a lot of these kind of, let's say, contrapuntal effects to work. Perhaps that's part of it, which gives you as a derivative notion between the horizontal and the vertical. Okay. The question is, if it's not the only example, maybe there are other interesting cases to look at. I don't propose that we go there for this purpose, but just as an example, Robert Irwin talks about similar kinds of ideas as a painter, the American painter, right? And I'll just mention this as a reference because it would be very interesting to look at how he thinks. He thinks in terms of his own paintings, but also installations as orientations of the spectator's attention to the environment, some of whose cues he puts in, but most of whose cues are not. Right? So that's it.
It's a very good point. I totally agree. In my work, of course, that linearity is kind of part of. It has been very strong. That's how I've been working. But I appreciate other possibilities too.
Last question or comment?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I was just, I thought the response to the question why the sound of the typewriter at the beginning, why the choice, and my immediate reading and perception was because it is at the beginning. I'm reminded of my early piano lessons where the metronome, bing, 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 and it's the typewriter, bing, bing, bing. There's a whole written time connotation involved. So that is what I wanted to add to the sound, why the sound sharing a reading, right?
It is an establishing shot, I guess, for me. So.
I think it's interesting to collect those establishing shots because, jazz musician will go 3 and 4 and everybody knows what to do. And we say, well, conductors don't do that, right? They don't count in an orchestra, but they do actually. There's a whole complex ritual about that beginning, and we don't let go of that easily. That's establishing where we're at.
The baby sound also is beginning, so I thought within the context, it's beautiful. It works. That's
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you very much.